Are we living in a computer simulation? How would we even know if we were? Why is the simulation hypothesis, the hypothesis that we are living in a giant computer simulation, so popular with some and so silly to others? What are some of the arguments for and against the simulation hypothesis? And how do philosophers think about it? Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Settecase, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. This episode is very special. I went to Notre Dame to meet with Dr. Brian Cutter. We've done another episode before on the philosophy of mind and artificial intelligence and whether or not robots can have souls, but this time I drove out to him to do an in-person conversation about the simulation hypothesis. Brian is an expert in the philosophy of mind, and he's someone who actually takes the simulation hypothesis seriously. Now, that doesn't mean he agrees with it or affirms it or anything like that. He doesn't think that we're living in a computer simulation, but he takes the arguments for and against it very seriously. I love talking with this guy. I always learn something new. So first, Brian's going to lay out the simulation argument from Nick Bostrom. We're going to compare and contrast the simulation hypothesis of Bostrom with the simulation hypothesis of David Chalmers, as he covers it in his book Reality Plus. And then I'm going to raise a bunch of philosophical arguments against the simulation hypothesis, and Brian pretty much knocks them all down. So listen to the full episode and you can get all the reasons for and against this hypothesis. If you guys like this podcast, if it's one of your top 5, top 10 favorites, then consider supporting me on Patreon or on YouTube Members. There are similar perks on both platforms, and you can support for different amounts. You can also support me by buying some Parker's Pensées merch, or using some of the discount links in my description. Get yourself some notebooks, some awesome leather goods, support companies that I love, and support me. So win-win-win. All right, that's probably enough commodification. Let's jump in with Dr. Brian Cutter. Let's explain the simulation hypothesis, and then let's cover some arguments for and against it.
Dude, so Brian, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Yeah, happy to be here again.
Yeah, this is awesome. So today we're going to be talking about, as I introduced, the simulation hypothesis. I wonder, as we're getting in here, can you recall like when you first heard about the simulation hypothesis?
Oh, good question. Maybe not under that name, but I don't know. I saw The Matrix when it came out. I think that was 1999. I don't know if that hypothesis had occurred to me before The Matrix, but when I saw it, I thought, oh, this is a cool idea. And, you know, it's one of these scenarios, like other kind of skeptical scenarios in philosophy, that it's like, well, if that's true, you could never rule it out with certainty that you're living in this virtual world, this simulation. And yep, I was philosophically minded as a 14-year-old or whatever I was when I saw it. So I found the hypothesis gripping and interesting at the time. Yeah, I mean, Matrix was such a huge, a big deal in pop culture that at least got the idea in the air. Let's see, I think I read Nick Bostrom's piece sometime in grad school, maybe, arguing that for taking seriously the idea that we live in a computer simulation.
Yeah. For whatever reason, I was big into the Matrix as well. For whatever reason, I hadn't considered just a quick little jump from like a brain in a vat to you are a wholly simulated being. Because I grew up with The Sims. One of my friends was obsessed with The Sims. And it wasn't until maybe college where I was a wrestler. All the wrestlers are goofy. They love goofy, weird stuff from Joe Rogan podcasts. So they were, I think they probably heard about Bostrom's paper from like Sam Harris on Joe Rogan. And so it was through there where I'm like, oh yeah, that's a little bit different, where it's like, maybe I'm wholly simulated. And then I was a campus missionary, and I'd be sharing the gospel with people, and they'd be like, what if we live in a computer simulation? You know? And I was like, oh snap, maybe I should actually start thinking about this.
Yeah, it's funny when I've taught Nick Bostrom's arguments for the simulation hypothesis, and I pitch it as like, here's this wild harebrained idea, this is going to blow your mind, and some of the students receive it and they're like, yeah, that's probably how it is. It's like, you shouldn't respond in that kind of way.
I love that. Yep. Well, so maybe we should say for those, I mean, if they listen to my podcast, they're going to know a little bit about it because I talk about it a lot. But what do you take the simulation hypothesis to be?
Yeah, so the simulation hypothesis would just be the hypothesis that we, or at least you could put it in the first person case, but let's say we are we live in a computer simulation. We are Sims in the terminology that's sometimes used. So we inhabit a virtual world that is implemented on a computer created by intelligent beings kind of in the next universe up. Yeah. So the thought is we don't live in base reality. We live in a kind of derivative reality that exists in virtue of the running of a computer program in some like higher level, more fundamental universe.
Yeah, so good. Do you think that, does that encompass brain in a vat like theory as well?
Yeah, so I would consider that a version of the simulation hypothesis, though probably among the less plausible versions of the simulation hypothesis. So yeah, I mean, if it turns out that I exist in the next universe up with in some kind of biological form with a body, or at least my brain, and then my brain is being, it's hooked up by wires to a computer that's kind of feeding it sensory input to make it seem to me as though I live in this like 3-dimensional world and I'm running around in it. That would be one way of being in a computer simulation, and that's kind of the picture that you get in the Matrix. The version of the simulation hypothesis that I think philosophers take more seriously, the version that Nick Bostrom and David Chalmers usually have in mind when they talk about the hypothesis, is one where like, no, we don't, like we and our physical embodiment exist purely in the simulated world. There's not like some physical brain of ours that exists outside the simulated world that's being fed signals. No, there's just like a simulated physical universe, and a part of that simulated universe is a simulation of a brain. And the thought is, well, if you merely simulate the behavior of like neurons in a brain, then that's going to give rise to consciousness. So it could well be that the consciousness that I experience is one of those streams of consciousness that's generated by purely computational activity. There doesn't need to be some like biological brain existing in the next universe up.
Yeah, so that's super helpful. So in this episode, I wanted to run through some objections that I've come across that a lot of them I don't think work, but are just like, spaghetti at the wall, see what sticks. Some that I've worked on that I don't think are going to work based on my conversations with other philosophers, but we'll see. One of the objections that people raise or have raised is that the simulation hypothesis, as you just gave it, of like pure sims, that we are pure sims, that we're not, there's nothing outside of base reality or in base reality, that's us, no brain in a vat, that it's committed to like machine functionalism. And there's reasons to think machine functionalism is false, therefore simulation hypothesis is false. I wonder, first of all, are there good reasons, do you think, to be a machine functionalist? And then secondly, like, it doesn't seem like simulation hypothesis is wholly committed to that theory of mind, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. If you look at Bostrom's argument for taking seriously the simulation hypothesis, one of his just unargued assumptions is something close to a functionalist view of consciousness. He calls this the thesis of substrate independence, the idea that consciousness can in principle be implemented on a wide variety of different material substrates. So it doesn't need to be like organic carbon-based material substrate. It could be implemented in like silicon-based computational substrates, so long as the system has the right kind of causal organization, relevantly like our brains, it's going to give rise to conscious experiences the way that our brains do. And the way he states it is that, we don't need to reduce consciousness to like a computational state. We don't need to say that like what consciousness is just implementing a certain kind of computation. We could instead, like David Chalmers, be like less reductive about consciousness, but say that nonetheless, the causal basis of consciousness is going to be some kind of substrate independent property, some kind of high level pattern of causal organization that can be implemented in a variety of different material substrates. So I think that's all you need in order to at least start getting some of the arguments for the simulation hypothesis off the ground. So the thought is, if you've got beings in base reality and then they program a computer to like simulate the dynamics of a brain, if you accept that having that right kind of causal organization is at least causally sufficient for generating consciousness, even if consciousness is itself not reducible to those computational patterns, then that's going to get you that, potentially you have loads and loads of conscious beings that live in computer simulations. Then the way the argument typically goes is like, well, on certain plausible assumptions, you're going to have the result that most of the conscious beings in reality live in computer simulations, or even most of the conscious beings with relevantly human-like experiences in reality live in computer simulations. And then there's going to be a kind of statistical inference from there that, okay, well, if most conscious beings are sims, then probably we are sims.
Yeah. He calls that like his bland indifference principle. I used to have a really big problem with that before I started studying some more epistemology, because it's like most conscious beings aren't me. Therefore, I'm not me. But I wonder, what do you make of that indifference principle? That is it necessary to get the argument going, or to finish the argument? And if so, should we attack it there, or is that like totally standard fare?
Yeah, so I think the argument, at least most versions of these arguments rely on some kind of indifference style reasoning. There's differences in exactly how to formulate the principle, and it's easy to kind of make mistakes here. So, there are indifference principles that are clearly wrong. So here's an indifference principle that might look plausible at first blush, but definitely can't be right, which is that, if most beings are F, then probably I'm F. Or, if the majority of conscious beings have a certain property, then probably I have that property. Like, that's a horrible principle.
That's good.
Because I know the majority of conscious beings live outside of South Bend. Should I conclude, therefore, probably what are the odds then that I would live in South Bend? No, okay, so that's bad. But what's going on there? Well, I have special evidence in my own case to know that, even though it's a tiny fraction of conscious beings who live in South Bend, I have kind of privileged information that I'm different, or I'm special in this particular respect. So the way Bostrom, I think, puts it is something like, if you know that like X% of conscious beings have a property F, and you don't have any further evidence that you're special with respect to this property, then your credence that you have F should be X%.
Mm-hmm.
So, I know that roughly 1 in 17 people have a number of hairs that's a multiple of 17. I've never counted my hairs. I don't have any evidence at all that I'm special with respect to this. So what should my confidence be that I have a number of hairs that's a multiple of 17? I claim, basically it should be 1 in 17. Mm-hmm. Or, an example Bostrom gives, if you know that, 95% of people have a certain kind of gene that maybe doesn't express itself in any visible way, and you don't have any special evidence that you're, about whether you have the gene or whether you're special in this regard, then your confidence that you have the gene should be about 95%. That seems very, very plausible. So I'm inclined to think that if these arguments go wrong somewhere, it's not going to be in the indifference claim. Yeah. That's at least not where I would want to attack the argument.
I think that sounds right. And it depends. The claim you might want to hit on would be like the indifference principle, or sorry, the substrate independence thesis, where it's like, well, maybe there's something more biological, but that's pretty tough to get at. And also, if you believe in angels, it's kind of tough, because you're like, well, they don't have biological brains.
Yeah.
Presumably they're conscious, right? I don't know what it would mean to say that an angel's not, or there's nothing it's like to be an angel.
Yeah. I would say that angels are conscious. I think, well, there's a way of formulating the substrate independent claim that's neutral as to angelic consciousness. So,
okay.
You could just say take something that is conscious, like me or like you. Then if there's some other being, there's some other physical system with the same abstract causal organization as you, then that being will be conscious and indeed have the same conscious experiences as you. Mm-hmm. That's a kind of organizational invariance claim. That's a claim that Chalmers defends. That's neutral on whether there could be something radically different from you that's also conscious.
Right.
It's not saying that you need to have this kind of causal organization in order to be conscious, just that any two things that are exactly alike with respect to their abstract causal organization are going to be exactly alike with respect to their consciousness.
That's so good. That's a really good clarification. Yeah. So it's just saying, look at these two organizational structures. It's reasonable to assume that this one is conscious as well. It doesn't say anything about other structures that could be all wonky and crazy or not. Okay. So that was really good. Just to maybe to clarify it. So Bostrom's argument amongst philosophers is like, this is the one we use. Maybe I feel like Chalmers' book hasn't got a super wide audience amongst academic philosophers as it has like in the public. A lot more people reading there, or like in the tech world, a lot more people reading that. But I wonder, are you familiar enough with Chalmers' version of the argument? Can you tell us, is it significantly different in your view from Bostrom's argument?
Yeah, so I mean, it's very much a cousin of Bostrom's argument. There are going to be some differences. So Bostrom argument relies a lot on the idea of ancestor simulations,
Right.
which are, we imagine like, well, eventually humans get to, very advanced stage of technological development where they're technologically able to run huge numbers of simulations. And in particular, he has in mind that they might want to run simulations of their ancestors, like of, their people who historically came before them. And the idea of an ancestor simulation doesn't play as big of a role in Chalmers' argument. So his thought is, so he's got this idea of I think it's something like a human-like subject or human-like conscious experience, which is any subject who has experiences with the same set of sim signs, or roughly the same balance of sim signs and non-sim signs as we find in our experience. So a sim sign is any feature of our experience that might be taken to be evidence that we are sims. A non-sim sign is any feature of our experience that might be taken to be evidence that we're not sims. So an example of a sim sign might be, well, maybe you find that you're just like a very distinguished person in the world. You find that you're the president, or you find that you're, the richest person on earth, or you find that you're some like, you run a really popular YouTube channel with lots of subscribers. And, you're really great at jujitsu, and like, okay, like you have this like privileged, distinguished position within the world you inhabit. Like, well, maybe that's more likely to be found among simulated beings, because the simulators are going to be more interested in simulating kind of like interesting lives rather than just like boring lives. Another one that Chalmers puts more weight on, or at least a fair amount of weight on, is finding yourself in the early part of the universe. He thinks like it's very, very striking. Like our best like astronomical and cosmological estimates say that like the universe will be, hospitable to life for, I forget the exact numbers, but like, tens, hundreds of billions of years after now. We find ourselves in a very, very early period within our universes, within the period of time at which it's going to be hospitable to life. That's a little bit suspicious. He's got arguments that simulators are going to have, while most beings will exist much later in the universe's history, they're going to have interest in simulating what happened very early on, perhaps out of reasons of scientific curiosity, doing kind of like alternative counterfactual historical analysis, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So those might be examples of sim signs. Examples of non-sim signs might be, well, we find ourselves in a like very richly structured, high resolution, detailed world. You might find that just for reasons of like computational efficiency, most sims would find themselves in like really low res, blocky, polygonal worlds with like without a lot of detail, and they'd be like relatively boring, simple worlds. Like our world is like incredibly rich, and when we look closely, there's all sorts of like fine-grained details. Now, to some extent, that might be kind of like filled in so like maybe the simulators aren't like simulating the fine molecular details of my tea right now, but if I got the microscope out, then it would kind of ad hoc fill in
starts rendering
something plausible. And we have video games and computer games that do something like this. It's just like computational shortcuts. But it remains true that like, there's just like a lot of richness and detail and structure in the world, and you might think that's some evidence that we're not sims, because like sims it'd be more likely they'd find themselves in like low res worlds. So anyway, the thought is, a human-like subject is going to be any subject whose experiences exhibit roughly the same balance of sim signs and non-sim signs.
Mm.
And then if you can argue that there are probably more human-like subjects who are sims than there are human-like subjects who are non-sims, then this is where the indifference principle comes in. Probably you are a sim. And so the conclusion of Chalmers' argument, it's actually a little bit different from the conclusion of Bostrom's argument. The conclusion of Chalmers' argument, if I recall correctly, is something like, with a very high probability, either there are sim blockers or we ourselves are sims. A sim blocker is defined as just like any factor that would prevent human-like subjects from creating sims, or maybe would prevent us from creating lots of sims. So one key example of a sim blocker might be, well, maybe consciousness isn't substrate independent. And that's one that I think, we should put some weight on that, because the substrate independence claim, it's not crazy, but it's also not obvious. I don't think we have much positive evidence that consciousness is substrate independent. So if you want to avoid the simulation hypothesis, or avoid giving it even like modestly high credence, one way to go is to just have like an extremely low credence in substrate independence. Say like with near certainty, consciousness really requires the right kind of material substrate. So merely duplicating the abstract structure of our processing in a computer would not reproduce consciousness. So that I see as like one promising line for responding to these arguments that like probably we are sims.
Well, do you think that a belief in continuation of disembodied state, like if you survive the death of your body, does that lend credence to the substrate independence thesis? Because you're not. It seems to me like the substrate doesn't matter so much, because you can still be constituted, or your soul can be like you can still perhaps have even conscious experience outside of the substrate that you either grew in or were associated with, without outside your brain. So I don't know, what do you make of that?
Yeah. So if you think that you can, or maybe like will after death, have a kind of period of disembodied existence, I'm friendly to that idea. That gives you one sense in which consciousness is substrate independent. It like does not strictly require that there be any material substrate at all. You could still have a conscious existence without any material substrate. I think that's a somewhat different kind of substrate independence than the kind that you need to run the simulation argument. So, I mean, the key substrate independence claim that figures in the simulation arguments is not just that, in principle, it's possible to have consciousness without any material substrate at all, but that if you duplicate, like basically, if you run a simulation of my brain, you will thereby get consciousness.
Yeah.
And the idea that I'm going to exist as a disembodied soul after death, I think doesn't lend any support to the idea that if you simulate my brain, you will thereby produce consciousness of the kind that I actually enjoy. I think those are just, those are very different claims. They don't have too much to do with one another. Accepting one doesn't really lend support to the other claim. It seems to me.
Good. That's helpful. Yeah, I love that point about, well, I think Chalmers brought this up in talking about Nozick's experience machine, where he's like, Nozick was really a famous, handsome philosopher. He should have asked himself. And then you go with Chalmers and you're like, well, you're world famous philosopher. For a philosopher, that's a pretty big deal, because no one really listens to philosophers all that much, as much as they did listen to him. So it's like, yeah, maybe you should consider yourself, which is it's really fun when it hits back on you. The more interesting life you have, the more probable it is that you live in a computer simulation.
Yeah, that's at least, I think that's a natural thought. I mean, I think relevant here is Elon Musk has said somewhere that he thinks it's like 99% certain or something that we live in a computer simulation. I think his arguments for that don't rely on the fact that he has a very distinguished role in our world, but he does, and I wonder what kind of role that plays in his psychology.
Yeah. Well, so I got some reasons that we might reject it. And in doing this, I'm trying to just sharpen myself here. I want these to go through, but I'm also like, I don't know how much these will or won't. But Michael Huemer's got this Bayesian argument against brain in a vat skepticism, and I asked him to apply it to simulation hypothesis too. So I just want to run that by you and see I may not be able to, redo it here because I always go in for the self-defeat to avoid the Bayesian stuff because it's really tricky for me. But he's basically saying, like, in considering whether or not you live in you're a brain in a vat or living in a computer simulation, you have to look at the probabilities. And so what's the probability that you'd live in a simulation that's this fine-grained, we talked about that already, with detail and having experience that's interpretable? He's like, look, just throw out a bunch of simulations. Most of them are going to be static. But then you start changing the parameters to make them specifically interpretable, like exactly like we are. You go in for the intentions of the simulators. You go in for the equipment that it would take, all that. And his argument is that you're lowering and lowering the probability each time you mess with it. Just from that rough sketch of it, what do you make of that kind of like probability argument against simulation hypothesis?
Yeah, I don't think that's a horrible way of framing the question. I think at least that sketch doesn't engage too much with the positive reasons for thinking that sims will massively outnumber non-sims.
Yeah.
So, Bostrom has this picture that, like, okay, maybe we avoid nuclear war, we avoid killing ourselves with AI, we avoid the engineered pandemics and so on. And you fast forward a few hundred years and we've reached this post-human stage where we just have massive computational power at our disposal. And he looks at some estimates that people have given for, like, what physics allows in terms of like how much computing power you can get out of, like, whatever cubic meter of matter, and give some estimates as to, like, okay, if we really kind of max out our technological capacities, how much compute will be available, and then how much compute would it take to simulate, the whole mental history of the human race. And basically, he runs the numbers and comes to this conclusion that if they wanted to, they would have enough computing power to, simulate the whole mental history of the human race a zillion times over using just 1% of 1% of the computing power available to them over a period of like 1 second. It's like the numbers involved, the computing power potentially at the disposal of our descendants could well just be utterly enormous.
Right.
And so all it would take is, if you reach that technological capacity, some kind of interest in running simulations of human-like beings. And it's not hard to think of reasons why, if it were super cheap and easy, you would want to run simulations of human-like beings. I mean, one might just be out of kind of like scientific curiosity. Like, what would happen if someone, some crazy celebrity like Donald Trump won the election in 2016? Like, let's just like see how that works. And or, what would have happened if, the Axis won World War II, and you can kind of like fiddle with different parameters there. There's tons of just kind of like reasons of historic curiosity, maybe reasons of entertainment, scientific curiosity, why a civilization like this might want to run lots of simulations. And if Bostrom's estimates are right, like, it will be just incredibly cheap and easy for them to do so. And so that's how he gets the thought that it's at least somewhat plausible that you could have a scenario with just massive, massive numbers of this. Of course, like, if I'm just one smart scientist sitting down trying to like program a simulation, it's going to be very, very hard for all the reasons that Mike Huemer brings out. But, we potentially have, hundreds, thousands of years in order to like figure out how to
just keep
design these things.
The future,
we're developing AI, so, the idea that it would be outside the abilities of even our post-human descendants in 10,000 years, like, I just think that's hard to rule out.
Yeah. This one wasn't really plausible to me because I think you can, like you said, you can just keep pushing it into the future. It really has to do with your own like plausibility structure. Like, just keep going. You say, look, that would take so long. Okay, well, make it 10 more years after that. 10 more, just, if you do have something approaching exponential growth in the tech sphere, then it's not that unreasonable. Compute power changes. And just go back to see, like in the 70s, what they said was possible in the year 2000 with compute, and how it's just, so far outstripped that. Another one from Bostrom, from his website at least, he talks about, he doesn't use this language, but he basically says there's no sim signs that you could have. he says that any positive evidence that we're living in a simulation, or any like anecdotal evidence, maybe you see some glitches in the mirror, or you point to the 2016 election, all the stuff that people do on the college campus all the time. He's like, well, we'd expect to see that in a non-simulated world too. We'd expect to have mental disorders, which might make you think different things, might make you think that you're living in a computer simulation. I wonder, so he's like, look, the simulators didn't want you to know that you live in a simulation. They could make it so that you don't know. They could either wind it back, and they could scrub your memory and all different types of things. But I always thought that depends on these motives of the simulators that we wouldn't have access to. And so it seems like Chalmers like, yeah, we have sim signs. And Bostrom's like, well, there's no, you can't have sim signs. Between the two, what do you think?
Yeah, so I haven't read the exact thing you're referring to from Bostrom. I mean, it strikes me as pretty clear that in principle it's possible to have evidence that you're a sim. I mean, to borrow an example from the literature on like brain and vat skepticism, like it could just be that like I see at the bottom of my visual field a kind of like ticker tape text scrolling across saying like, you live in a simulated world, And maybe if I'm still doubtful, maybe it like makes all sorts of predictions about what I'm about to see, and those predictions turn out to be correct. And I mean, or think of the experiences that Neo goes through when he meets like Morpheus and they tell him the whole thing. Like, there's a
well, he did take a draw. He took a, well,
I guess he eventually gets out, but whatever. It just seems clear that there are streams of experience you could have that would just be basically like slam dunk evidence that you are in a computer simulation.
Yeah.
It's less clear that you could get slam dunk evidence that you're not in a computer simulation. I don't quite know what that would look like. I mean, I think that there can be some evidence, but because there are these non-sim signs, but having anything like the degree of conclusiveness that the positive evidence could have, I think that's not right. So I mean, I to me that shows the kind of in principle possibility. Like you could have experiences that are evidence that you live in a computer simulation, and then now we're just kind of haggling over price. Like, what about stuff we actually experience? Is that evidence? And yeah, I don't see why not. I don't see why, being in a distinguished position or some of these other features maybe existing in the very, very early universe wouldn't necessarily be, at least some evidence.
Yeah. I think the predictions, I think that's pretty like slam dunk. Like, because you could always say, if you're seeing a ticker tape, then maybe you have schizophrenia or something. But if someone's telling you, here's what's about to happen in your life, and you could say, hey, come with me and make sure that this happens or not. Now you have evidence from other folks that it's not just you. And that one seems really good. Well, how about Parsimony? So Chalmers in his book, which I love the book Reality Plus. I thought it was so good. And the questions he deals with are refreshing. It's like, oh, finally, someone's talking about this stuff. It's really cool.
Yeah.
He considers theism, and he says, hey, look, some of the best arguments for theism are teleological arguments, the design arguments, but they might stop short and get us just to a creator, but a simulator God.
Yep.
With lowercase g, then a cosmic God. And I'm wondering, you have the symmetry between the two. You have the existence of teleology in nature, and you say that's evidence for a creator. But now there's this stalemate or deadlock between a cosmic God and a simulator God. He says, well, I think his reasoning is pretty wild here. I'd love to talk to him about it. He's like, look, the creator God has these properties that are like uninstantiable, being worthy of worship. But the simulator God isn't worthy of worship, and so let's go with that. I want to get your thoughts on that real quick, and I also want to talk about parsimony. Theism has one less level of reality. We don't have a simulated world, and so maybe it's more parsimonious, a better explanation for teleology. What do you make of that?
Yeah, good. So I think it depends a lot on which kind of teleological argument you're looking at. If it's, let's say, the cosmological fine-tuning argument, I don't see too much that would favor theism over simulation, or vice versa. because it seems like God would have reason to fine-tune the fundamental constants of the universe to allow for life, but simulators might also have reason to do that because they want to simulate a world with life. And both of those seem like they could explain it. I mean, I do think theism has, virtues of parsimony, so that's something there. I mean, some people here say like, well, the simulator hypothesis here would just push the problem back because, the higher level universe, the more fundamental universe, they must have living things because, they got people who can build these computers and run the simulations. Why doesn't that just move the bump in the rug or push the problem back? But I don't think that's a great objection because we don't know what the physics of that world looks like. We don't, like, for all we know, the physics of the simulator's own world isn't fine-tuned. It doesn't need the basic constants to be in a very narrow life permitting range, because we don't know anything about that. So I think that kind of like meta fine-tuning problem, it doesn't really have too much bite. But I think the situations,
there has to be some kind of like order, right, for them to even do the science needed to make a simulation.
Yeah, good. So I think if you focus on different kinds of teleological arguments, then these revenge problems, I think, will make problems for the simulation hypothesis. So like, I've written a paper recently with Brad Saad, and we kind of discuss a kind of argument for theism or against naturalism that one version of this is, well, our universe is made up of different elements, and the causal powers of those elements are coordinated with one another so as to allow for like interesting forms of interaction. Yeah. So it's not like you've got X's and Y's, and X's don't have the power to do anything with respect to Y's, and Y's don't have the power to do anything with respect to X's, so nothing happens. Like, no, all the different like basic parts of the universe, they have these causal powers that are kind of reciprocally coordinated with one another so as to allow for interesting kind of dynamical evolution. And that's something that, seems to me to call for explanation. Here, the simulation hypothesis definitely doesn't work because it really does move the bump in the rug. If I say, okay, well, this universe is simulated and it was programmed to have these reciprocally coordinated causal powers, then you can say, well, wait a minute, the simulator's own universe, if they're going to build a computer, if there's going to be people in it of any kind, maybe they're different kinds of people from us, but they've got like some kind of physical computer and some kind of people, that's a universe with different elements with causal powers that are reciprocally coordinated. You can't, so that kind of like harmonious coordination of the causal powers, you need that in order to have anything that could be called a computer at all. Yeah. I mean, that's just the way computers work. So that's a case where you got a kind of design argument for that might be used for theism, where the simulation hypothesis just doesn't account for the data, or not in a way that doesn't just like make the same problem re-arise. I think the same, I mean, I don't know if on previous episodes we might have talked about psychophysical harmony, the kind of harmonious coordination of consciousness and physical properties. There's another case where I think there's just the simulation hypothesis just does not explain that. I mean, it just moves the bump in the rug. Yeah. The simulators, they don't have any control over the basic psychophysical laws. They can control the kind of physical dynamics of our universe. They don't control the psychophysical laws. They can't, make consciousness harmoniously coordinated with our physical functioning. So that's a case where I think theism probably has the advantage over the simulation hypothesis. But I think it really just depends on what design argument you're thinking about. Fine tuning, they're probably roughly on a par, or if they're not, the tie is going to be broken through parsimony considerations. But with others, I think theism probably has the advantage.
Yeah. I want to get back to that, but I wonder. I've heard this actually from YouTube comments a lot. And it's a good point about we don't know about the laws of physics in base reality, and we don't need to. And I think Chalmers does a good job of sticking to that point. But it seems like Bostrom's does fall to that, because on Bostrom's simulation argument, it's the whole premise, and he doesn't need it, I guess, but it's that we're ancestor simulation. So it's like, well, then they should have the same laws that we have. And he motivates that by saying, he motivates the whole argument, maybe substate into independence thesis and the just technological advancement needed to make a computer simulation. He motivates that by saying, look at our history of technological development. And so just imagine in the future what it'll be like then. And so that's like the thought experiment that gets us to the point of a simulation in the first place. But if the base reality is different, has different laws and different scientific history,
yeah,
then it's like, well, did you just cut off the ladder that we used to climb up to your argument?
Yeah. That's an interesting point about Bostrom's argument, because he is, a lot of his discussion kind of envisions base reality as basically like our reality.
Right.
It's just, the real one, and this is the fake one, but it's the same kind of universe, same kind of physics, same kind of, galaxies and all this stuff. So you're right that he's going to face a version of like the fine-tuning question. Maybe the fine-tuning of our universe is explained by the simulators,
right.
But what explains the fine-tuning of base reality? I mean, ultimately you're going to have to say something about that.
Right.
I don't see that as a problem for his argument for simulation, because he wasn't arguing that we're probably sims on the grounds that we need that to explain fine-tuning.
Yeah.
He had this more statistical argument that, well, there's given certain assumptions, most conscious beings will be sims, therefore probably we're sims. So, I mean, but you can still do a kind of worldview comparison. Like, okay, so suppose we are sims, but base reality has the same kind of physics that we find in our world. Maybe differences in kind of the details of history, but same basic physical structure. Then there's got to be some explanation for cosmological fine-tuning in that universe. So what's that? Well, maybe God. I mean, it could be that like we are sims, but the creator of base reality is God. There's a paper by Dustin Crummett in, I think, Religious Studies, where he basically employs the simulation hypothesis as a way of responding to the problem of evil. Basically, we explain natural evil by a kind of free will theodicy, tracing it to the free will of the simulators who created us. And maybe their universe is fine-tuned or has all these kind of features that suggest design, and that's because God directly designed their universe and then indirectly created ours. That's a weird view.
He came on to talk about that. Folks, if you want to see that episode, find the link in the description. Super goofy, but it is like, I think even Dustin was like, no, I don't believe that. But it's one way to collapse down natural evil into moral evil, and then you have the free will defense, because otherwise you need maybe two or more.
I'll make a plug for a paper I'm writing with Philip Swenson, where we have another way of giving a free will theodicy for natural evil or apparent natural evil that doesn't invoke simulations, and hopefully it'll come out soon.
That's good. Awesome. I love that. Well, okay, so I already kind of broached this, but this one's from James Anderson, and it's against particularly against Bostrom's version, and it's that self-defeat. And I didn't do it justice yet, but how he does say that he runs it like a evolutionary argument against naturalism, Plantinga type style, and says there are certain assumptions that Bostrom needs in order to get the ball rolling. One of those assumptions is the technological advancement. But if we do live in a computer simulation, we don't know the history of base reality. So we're asked to consider our simulated reality and the history thereof, and say, well, look, on this, of course there'll be simulations, but how do we know that took place in base reality once we come to believe that we're in a simulation? And so I wonder if that self-defeat style argument has any warrant for you.
Yeah, this is I think a really tricky question, and one that I don't know if I've really managed to think through in a way that I'm totally satisfied with. But you're right that there is something really fishy and kind of self-eating, like snake eating its tail character about some ways of developing the argument. Where it's like, okay, why should we think that most conscious beings are sims? And then I start to tell a story about how, like, well, probably we're going to develop to a state of technological development where we have all this computing power, and then we are going to create all these sims. And so, and there'll be so many of them that they'll outnumber the non-sims. But, well, wait a minute. Like, we already know we're not the sims that we ourselves are going to create, because those are in the future.
Yeah.
The thought is, oh, well, actually, no, that history is like already played out in the real base reality, and because they went back and simulated their ancestors, and we're one of those ancestors. But wait a minute, like, my whole reason for thinking that was based on, like, the assumption that I live in a real world and here's how it's going to go. And did I just undercut my evidence for accepting the statistical claim once I come to accept the conclusion that I am in a sim? Because now that empirical evidence is highly suspect. Like if I am in a sim, who the hell knows what we are going to go on to do? Like maybe they'll cut off the simulation 5 minutes from now. Like it depends on the purposes of the simulators. I do think there are ways of maybe running a version of the argument that doesn't have this self-defeating nature. So
I think Chalmers' teleological move is like spot on. I'd been thinking that, where I'm like, you could do it that way and it's different because you don't need to tell a story about any kind of simulation. All you need to do is say, you theists have all these arguments for God, but they may not run all the way through to base reality. And so let's have a symmetry. And I like it. I think it works better because it doesn't ask you to have these assumptions which may get undercut once you affirm the conclusion.
Yeah, that's one way of getting there. I mean, another way of thinking about it is, okay, let's start with, I like to just draw this out as a flow chart, and this is what I do when I teach the argument. Like, first question: are there human-like subjects in base reality? Yes or no? Well, if no, then we're definitely sims because we know that we're human-like subjects. So if there aren't any of those in base reality, then we're not in base reality, and so we got to be sims. Okay, so let's take the path down the flow chart that says yes, there are human-like beings in base reality. Well, do many of them live, like, continue to exist to a post-human state, a state where there's enough computing power available that they can cheaply and easily run lots of simulations? Yes or no? Well, if yes, then most conscious beings are sims, and therefore we are sims.
Yeah.
If no, well, then that's just to say that like the vast majority of human-like subjects will not go on to come to a post-human state. So that you get this disjunction, which is a bit like the disjunction of Bostrom's argument, that either we're almost certainly sims or we are going to go extinct before we reach the post-human state.
Yeah.
But I mean, well, there's a gap in that argument, which is like, I'm assuming that if we go on to run the sims, then they will have the conscious experiences. So one way to resist that I mentioned earlier is like actually just reject that kind of substrate independence claim. So like, well, even if we simulate the brains of all the people we like, that's not going to generate experiences. Then you don't get the statistical claim.
You have a paper. I can't remember the name. I never do. It's like on robot souls where we go over the
AI ensoulment hypothesis.
So everyone go check that out. I'll put a link to that one as well. Yeah, because some people might just jump on that and be like, well, yeah, no substrate independence. Like, well, there's some good reasons to believe in that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can say that the way I kind of think about the argument nowadays is the interesting claim that is defensible is that conditional on most conscious beings being sims, then probably you are a sim. Okay, so that I'm willing to accept. But I also think we should have a very low credence in the claim that we are sims. Okay. So how can we swing that? Well, that's gonna, I think, require having a low. Basically that's going to require having a fairly low credence in most conscious beings being sims. To what extent can that be justified? Well, here it's going to be a matter of kind of like how you build up the priors. The background thought here is, look, we are rationally entitled to basic priors that are anti-skeptical. That is, that encode a kind of bias against being in various kinds of skeptical scenarios, like, the universe was created 5 minutes ago with false memories, Cartesian demon scenarios, counter-inductive scenarios where the world's going to the sun's not going to rise tomorrow, even though everything's just as it has been up to the present date. Boltzmann brain scenarios where, I'm a Boltzmann brain. So it's rationally permissible, maybe rationally obligatory to rely on priors that encode anti-skeptical assumptions. There's different ways to do that. But one way to do that would be to have a kind of bias in the priors against scenarios where you're in worlds where the vast majority of beings phenomenal with these experiences are radically deceived.
Yeah.
So I think it's like rationally permissible and maybe rationally obligatory to use basic priors that encode a kind of bias against scenarios where most conscious beings with these experiences are sims. How to do that? Well, two key ways. One is a kind of pessimistic way that, most species, when they get to a human-like stage, die before they get to the post-human stage where they can run all these fancy simulations. Another more optimistic way that I'm more partial to is, no, the prior should just encode a kind of strong bias against substrate independence. Or in some way encode a bias that merely simulating the causal dynamics of a brain is not going to generate consciousness. So I think if you start with the idea that it's rationally justified to rely on priors that encode an anti-skeptical bias, that can get you to a kind of almost a priori justification for rejecting the possibility of computer-based consciousness.
Right. Yeah. So I wonder, I asked Matthew Benton about this question when the metaverse was just coming out and it was still a really big deal. And I thought, if we have evidence of someone creating metaverses, and maybe this doesn't work on the Sims hypothesis because you have these priors against substrate independence, which is needed to have pure Sims. But what if you had someone going around invading people into metaverses? Would that make it? Would that mess with the priors that are biasing against the idea that you live in a simulation?
Yeah, good. I mean, just off the cuff, I wouldn't want to model that as messing with the priors. I would want to think of it as okay, you get evidence that maybe, go against some of the biases in your priors. I mean, if you.
Would it make it more probable, like modally unsafe? Is it more?
So how does this scenario work? So I see some mad scientists going around, plucking people's brains out and putting them in vats, and this is supposed to make me worried that maybe I'm a brain in a vat. Maybe we've gotten to the
or does
point.
it raise the probability?
I think it maybe depends on the details. Do I know anything about the experiences that he's giving them once he invats them?
Yeah.
If I know that he's just going to give them experiences of flocking around in the garden, then, I'm not experiencing myself flocking around in the garden, so that there's no reason for skepticism here. But if I know that, no, actually the experiences he's going to give them are experiences of there being a scientist who's plucking people's brains, the very experiences that I'm having now, then I start, I don't know, I start to worry. And so, if I know that my computer upstairs, it's on a timer, and it's once it runs, it's going to run 10 computer simulations of Brian's brain having this interview with Parker. Okay, now I start to be maybe I'm one of the Sims. But one way in which the anti-skeptical priors might encode a bias against that is just making those scenarios kind of unlikely in the first place. So this is not going to help if you already find yourself in the scenario where there's the brain snatchers. But if someone like Bostrom or Bostrom Star comes along and says here's my hypothesis, in the future there will be all these weird brain snatchers, or in the future we're going to create these simulations and there's going to be lots of them and they're going to be conscious, then my anti-skeptical priors say, very, very unlikely that that's true in one way or another. In the brain case, I think the way it's going to be unlikely is just, I don't think the scientists are going to eventually go snatch people's brains. In the simulation case, I'm open to the idea that we will eventually create highly detailed brain simulations, but the bias here is going to be expressed by a low confidence that those beings would be conscious.
Yeah, that's really good. All right. Well, so I want to get into some goofy transcendental proposed refutations. Starting with Putnam's against brain in a vat skepticism. Putnam goes in for semantic externalism, and he's when we say we are brains in vats, it gets so tricky when I get into like disquotational language and stuff. But it's basically like, look, you can't refer to base reality brains and base reality vats, because if you are a brain in a vat, you've never had experience with them, unless the whole argument falls apart if you've been recently invatted, which is really hard. But let's say you haven't been. So all your interaction is with brains and vats, which are in the simulation, or he says in the picture, but in the simulation. So when you say we are brains in a vat, those concepts and words like don't refer to base reality. And so they refer to simulated reality, but in simulated reality, you're not a brain in a vat.
Yeah.
So he says that statement is necessarily false. And it's so fast and so quick, and like, that sounds great, man. That's awesome. But Chalmers goes in for two-dimensional semantics, which I first heard from you on my podcast, and then I was able to ask him about it, and it sounded cool. So thanks for that.
Nice.
But can you help explain his way around this with why we don't non-twin earthable concepts, I guess?
Yeah. So Chalmers' discussion of Putnam's anti-skeptical arguments aren't really fresh at my fingertips, but one relevant thing here will be the Putnam response is it's only going to work for like so-called twin earthable concepts. So like tree or water, like these are going to be twin earthable concepts. Like basically what they pick out will be dependent on what stuff in my environment actually is causally related to me in the right way. So sure, if I'm in a simulation and then my word tree means whatever kind of computational structure normally gives me tree-ish experiences, and in which case, maybe when I say there are trees, I'm speaking truly. But there's going to be other concepts that like aren't sensitive to my environmental context in the same way. So like cause might be one of these, philosopher might be one of these, and maybe some of our like temporal concepts will be among these. So I mean, I think you can still have skeptical scenarios, like maybe I'm in a computer simulation that just came into being kind of in the year 2023. They kind of like set the conditions at 2023 and then tried to roll it forward. Well, then my concept that, I've got temporal concepts, and I think that I have existed for more than 10 years. I think that's going to turn out false in the simulation scenarios where they started it in 2023. Right. So, maybe some common sense claims like there are trees or I have hands are going to turn out true for kind of Putnam style reasons, even if I'm in a simulation. But at least depending on the details, there's at least going to be some claims that I want to make that will turn out false, and so I think are going to be simulation scenarios will count as skeptical scenarios with respect to some common sense claims.
I love that. Because for so long people have just been saying, well, you need to read The Matrix as Metaphysics by Chalmers, because he says there's two levels of reality and they have their own truth. And that's a good point about truth claims about your own existence and stuff. I wonder if you think a pure Sims concept of computer could refer, because computers are like a functional concept. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, what I mean by computer is something that certainly a computer could exist in a simulation. When I say I was on my computer this morning, like that's not going to turn out false if I turn out to be in a simulation.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. Well, so based on Putnam's, I really like it. I wish it worked. I don't know that it's like I don't know that it actually does, but I've made my own and I forgot to write it down. So I want to see if I can which is maybe funny for folks at home, but when you get to this level of trying to make arguments, it's like, I really just need to write it down. But so I think maybe a necessary condition of being rational, and just go with me on rational, because I know that we can get fine grained on that, but of just being rational, whatever that means, is that you can at least implicitly trust your knowledge forming faculties to reliably produce true beliefs. But if you live in a computer simulation, if you come to believe that you live in a computer simulation, then you have a reason, at least to withhold trust in your knowledge-forming faculties. Therefore, if you come to believe that you live in a computer simulation, you can't trust the products of your knowledge-forming faculties, including that.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. It does seem to me that it's going to run into trouble with the like ticker tape scenarios that we described. So,
Yeah.
I get the text at the bottom of my visual field saying, "Hey, Brian, surprise, you're in a computer simulation," and maybe more predictive evidence that convinces me of that. Okay, that tells me that like I'm in some kind of like weird skeptical scenario. So my rational faculties are in some ways leading me astray, but I don't think that the result. So to some extent, okay, now maybe I distrust perception, and to some extent I distrust my memories because who knows how long this simulation has been going on. But I don't think I wholesale distrust my reasoning abilities in a way that would undermine the reasoning that convinced me that, oh, if there's a ticker tape, then probably I am in a... There, I think that reasoning was perfectly good. Yeah, I mean, it is... So I guess there are other more mild scenarios where you can undermine trust in one of your faculties, or some maybe get some kind of partial distrust in your faculties, but not in a way that wholesale undermines. So like maybe I know I've just been given a drug that messes with my memory, so anything I seem to remember I'm going to distrust. Or I know I've been given a drug that messes with my ability to multiply numbers specifically. Okay, so when it seems to me that like 8 times 7 is 56, I'm going to be like, but maybe not. But that doesn't necessarily undermine just like the base level reasoning that got me to distrust the partial faculty in the first place. So
if you take a pill that you've taken that undermines your cognitive faculties in general, right? So like my ability to produce true beliefs, if there is such a pill, right?
Yeah.
Would that undermine even the belief that you've taken that pill?
Yeah, I mean, I think that scenario is a little bit harder to imagine. So I take a pill and I learn one of the effects of this pill is nothing that you believe after taking it is true, including whether you've taken the pill. And, okay, so something's gone wrong here. I can't be like, well, I've taken the pill, therefore I should distrust. Well, wait a minute. Okay, so I don't know. I think if you're in the position where you believe you've taken a pill that makes it that all your beliefs are false, something's gone wrong. Yeah. You shouldn't believe that you've taken such a pill. What should you do if you seem to have lots of evidence of that? I don't know. Yeah. But that does seem to be more extreme than merely finding that your kind of external environment doesn't have the nature you thought it did. Right. I think there you can maintain, like, even if perception or maybe even memory gets undermined, the kind of basic trust in your reasoning abilities, I think, doesn't necessarily get undermined. I mean, maybe it's a little bit different if you think, oh, but also the simulators, they're like carefully manipulating the way people reason about simulation scenarios, and they're trying to make it so that people reason in like comically dumb ways about whether they're in a simulation. Okay, then I feel like, okay, then that's more like the truth pill scenario that I do kind of throw up my hands and say like, screw it, I'm not gonna trust my reasoning about this.
This is what Sandy Goldberg gave me the same answer, and so I'm thinking you guys are probably right, but I'm wondering. So I call it improper function. If you come to believe that you're a sim, then you do believe that there's a simulator who made you. Mm-hmm. Depending on the story, I guess, if you're more careful and you say just simulation theory or hypothesis, but if you bake in some more stuff like Bostrom does, then there's the intentions of the simulators that you need to consider. Mm-hmm. And it seems like you have a design plan. They designed you to function in this cognitive environment, the simulation, and presumably you're properly functioning according to that design plan. But your cognitive faculties aren't aimed at truth in this scenario. They're aimed at like base reality truth, or simulated reality truth. You're designed to function in this simulation, So one, why think that you can ever reason about things outside the simulation? Well, because maybe reason is reason in base reality, or, maybe that's the case. But what are the intentions of the designers? And if they're inscrutable, then I think maybe you have a reason to at least withhold confidence in your belief forming or knowledge forming faculties. Because, if their whole goal is to say what would happen if Donald Trump won the 2016 election, I have to have certain beliefs in order for all this stuff to happen.
Yeah.
So did you jigger with it or not?
That's interesting. I mean, one thought I have here is kind of related to my points about it's rationally acceptable and maybe rationally obligatory to have anti-skeptical priors.
Mm-hmm.
And one part of that might be, you're rationally justified in kind of having an a priori trust in the truth directedness and reasonability and proper functioning of your basic cognitive faculties.
Totally.
But then that's going to ramify into what kind of world you think you live in.
Yes.
That's going to imply an a priori bias against being in any scenario where actually your faculties were not designed in a truth aimed way.
Yes.
And so if you think that simulation scenarios are such scenarios where maybe your faculties have a purpose, but they're not truth directed, that might also justify a kind of strong a priori bias against being in a simulation scenario. I think that's interesting. I do wonder if there's any difference between the simulation scenario and just like ordinary naturalistic evolutionary views. So, I mean, of course, planning wants to say that, well, if our cognitive faculties came about through evolution by natural selection, then they're not aimed at truth in the right way, and this has a kind of self-undermining character to them, to that view. So, I mean, there's a big issue there, but at least some people would want to say that, okay, well, Darwinian evolution can create belief-forming faculties that are aimed at truth. How that story goes, I don't know, but maybe that can be done. If unguided Darwinian evolution can produce faculties of that kind, it's not clear that you couldn't get faculties of that kind in a simulation. I mean, especially if the simulators are just kind of like setting up the initial conditions and letting the simulated evolutionary process go through, then presumably that simulated evolutionary process could produce the same kinds of cognitive faculties that are actually produced by unguided evolution in base reality.
Yeah.
Maybe it's different if the simulators are kind of like specifically tinkering with the cognitive capacities of the agents within it. Then you might say that those faculties get the purpose that corresponds to the intentions of which is maybe like entertainment of the spectators or something.
Yeah. Or if they had a specific history that they wanted you to reenact or a certain goal, then you'd have to. But yeah, like the evolutionary one is that's right. So I think if it does go through, it just limits what kind of simulation we could be in, I guess. Well, Brian, man, this has been awesome. We're out of time here. One last thing would be psychophysical laws. I think those get us through to a different that can break the symmetry. I think maybe abstracta too. If you're any kind of Platonist, you have a better explanation on theism than you do with a computer simulator god, moral truth, stuff like that. But
I think moral reliability. Some of those arguments are going to probably favor theism over the simulation view. Yep.
So that's all we did, folks. We're just exploring some of these options and stuff. Maybe we can run it back again. Dude, thanks so much for your time. This has been awesome.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.